So, good evening. Welcome to week one of CompTIA Security Plus Prep Short Course with George Thomas. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. With that out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to our short course teacher presenter today, Dr. George Thomas. And you may have seen he has several credentials, including CCISO, CDPSE, CIPM, many, many more. He also has his Masters of Management and his doctorate in Information Technology. And he has been recognized as a Microsoft MVP 3 times and is a member of the Professional Ethics Committee on the Australian Computer Society Professional Advisory Board, and a former board member of ISACA's New York Metro chapter. And he has been an adjunct lecturer at Charles Sturt University with us, IT Masters, since 2019. If you haven't heard of us before, IT Masters is an online education organisation offering IT postgraduate qualifications with IT industry knowledge embedded in them in conjunction with Charles Sturt University. So this course, the CompTIA Security Plus Prep course, is based on our subject ITI 581 and the CompTIA Security Plus test. If you complete that industry certification, you can get credit into it for that subject in our courses. And if you complete 3 of these free short courses, you can get credit into our masters. We will talk more on this later, but for now, I'd like to pass this over to George, who can start the webinar, and we can all start learning.
Thanks, Chantel. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Welcome. It's great to have everyone jump on board as I sit here and watch the participant numbers tick up. I think it's been a little while since I saw numbers like this. As Chantel mentioned, I teach some of the other subjects through IT Masters, Charles Sturt. And I think last year I ran, and the year before, maybe the year before that. Can't believe 2019, it's been 5 years now of running these webinars. So yeah, welcome. As you're all here for, CompTIA Security Plus. I thought it was interesting when Chantel was introducing me and talking about all these acronyms. And I sort of sit there and go, yeah, okay, that's a lot of acronyms. A lot of them start with C. And then I think Security Plus, wow, there's one that's actually almost self-explanatory. So we have quite a lot of content to get through. As you know, it's broken down into the 4 weeks or modules. For anyone that does have the or has seen the text, you will notice that it's broken down into sort of 16 sections. And so, you know, for this, I guess, short course, we sort of try to consolidate them as best I can into the 4 weeks. I guess, you know, the point here is we're probably going to go through the content quite quickly. There is a lot of content. And we'll try and cram as much as we can in you know, the sort of 1 to 2 hours that we have over the next 4 weeks. So this week we will go through a bit of an introduction, and by the way, that's not an introduction to me, that's already been done. That's an introduction to security fundamentals. So that's what we will cover off this week. Maybe a little bit of an introduction on CompTIA as well, and the Security Plus certification. So with that, CompTIA, for anyone that's not familiar with them, they're a global certification and sort of professional body. And what they have is they have a bunch of different certifications, such as Security Plus, as you are all here for. There's also, you may be familiar with A+, Network Plus. Certainly, you know, they've been around for quite some time. A fun fact, my first vendor neutral certification, and I say that very specifically because I've had vendor certs before that, but my first vendor neutral certification was Security Plus. And so I did that back in 2013, so quite some time ago. And I could say that, you know, that really helped boost my career into the pure security space. So I'd always worked in sort of engineering, architecture, and those sorts of things, and even management roles that were probably more broad IT with, you know, a bit of a security specialization, and then I became a pure play security, I guess, professional, pretty much after doing this exam. So obviously I had some experience before that as well, but it was a very valuable exam and very valuable certification to have at the time. I'm not going to read that out. I'm just going to keep going through. There's no mandatory text for this course. All the assessments will be covered in the material for anybody that's wondering. However, there is a study guide available. Otherwise, as Chantel said, this is also part of one of the IT Masters courses. But what I will say is that what we will cover off today is taken from the official content. So, which is useful, obviously, for anyone that goes to sit the exam at some point, that the terminology will align, all those sorts of things. So with that introduction, information security. If anyone that's done any of the other short courses that I've run, probably all of them, you will have seen this before. Or for anyone that's in the field or has been in the field for quite some time, or even maybe not quite some time, you will have seen this before. So this is known as the CIA Triad, and also known as the AIC Triad in some industries, such as critical infrastructure. So here we have the three, I guess, principles of the Triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And when we think about information security, it really does focus on CIA and protecting CIA. So protecting the confidentiality of information. So here it says information should only be read by authorized persons. In other words, not having unauthorized access. So this is when you think about things like data breaches, and that's, I think, in the news almost every second day. That is a breach of confidentiality or a breach of that C principle. Integrity is around the accuracy of that information and that it hasn't been tampered with or corrupted or something like that. And so, as it says here, data is stored and transferred as intended, and any modification is authorized. So if someone goes in and fiddles with banking information, for example, and suddenly you go in there and you've got no money, well, that's obviously very bad, but that would be a integrity compromise. And then availability is the ability to access information for those that are authorized to view or modify it. So here we think about things like denial of service. So denial of service is when a system is attacked and it is no longer accessible by the people that need it. So if you think about a website that's running and say, and it doesn't necessarily have to be malicious. So let's say there's a website that's running, let's say Black Friday sales, and it gets hammered by customers who want to buy stuff, and then the website goes offline because it's getting hammered. That would actually be a breach of availability. So, you kind of trying to set the context here on, how this kind of all fits together. And what we actually have, and probably less relevant maybe for Security Plus, but if anyone has seen the CISSP course that I've run, there's also the concept of the DAD Triad, so DAD. And I like to talk about it because it's the opposite. So when confidentiality fails, you end up with disclosure. When integrity controls fail, you end up with alteration. And when availability fails, you can have like denial of service or destruction. So ransomware, for example, would also fall under that availability principle. The other one to be aware of, which isn't part of the CIA Triad, which I think is probably obvious, is non-repudiation. So non-repudiation is about persons not being able to deny that they created or modified data. So it's really important because what's happening here is when you have when you focus on non-repudiation, and when you say you have an event that happens, it needs to be able to be, I guess, proved that someone has done something. So, and this is where you have things like authorization and access controls, and you have the identification process where but it's basically enforcing non-repudiation. Obviously, there can be issues where if people are sharing credentials and stuff like that, but what's really important when looking at information security is that someone who has done something, it can be proven that it is them. And I know in one of my subjects that we go through, which is cyber warfare and terrorism, we always talk about attribution and things like that. So, you know, these are sort of linked together. But anyway, that's the CIA triad in a nutshell, plus non-repudiation. So this is really the focus of information security. There's a lot of questions that are starting to pop up there. I can't read them, but I see the number going up. I will take a pause between the sections. So I think there's a few slides, and then we'll pause and go through some of the Q&A. Cybersecurity framework. So when we think about cybersecurity operations and how an organization's cybersecurity operations are structured, then it's quite common for a framework to be applied. So the framework will basically provide a structure for how that program operates. And so if you look at this one here, normally I'd probably ask the question, does anyone know what this is? But given we have a lot of folks on the call, this one is based on NIST. And so many of you may be familiar with the work of NIST. And we're not going to go into the huge amount of detail here, but NIST focuses on these 5 areas. So identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So if anyone that's familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, you will be familiar with those areas of NIST. And so what happens is when you take this framework like NIST, you can then look at the controls within there and apply them to your organization. And if you look at some of the course material, there's often sort of links to the white papers and further detail on this. So, but having said that, it's not necessary to be across NIST in a great level of detail for the exam. So what you really need to know here is kind of, this is an example of a cybersecurity framework, and how that can be applied. So that's NIST, but there are many others. So as I said, this is NIST cybersecurity framework. You see other frameworks like ISO that's out there. There's quite a lot of them. All right, and I'm sorry that there's a lot of content to cover. So keep those sort of questions coming in because we'll sort of skip through it. Right. So one of the things to get started when an organization is looking at their cybersecurity posture is a gap analysis. And so what the gap analysis does is it allows you to identify the sort of maturity level of an organization and then get a view of where there are issues that then need to be remediated. And so what we could see here in this gap analysis is that the function is aligned to that cybersecurity framework. So in this instance, taking that framework and then doing a gap assessment based on that framework is kind of what's happened here. And so businesses may be framework oriented, or they may use it because of regulatory requirement. And so what this section is really just trying to provide some sort of basic concepts. We will go into risk management in a little bit more detail. Now, anyone that's got the text will see that risk management is at the very end of the text, but we're actually going to cover that today. So I'm going to put that up because I think risk management is important. And so what we have here is you could see that under identify, asset management, governance, and risk assessment will actually sit. So if you go and get the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a freely downloadable resource from NIST.gov. So NIST being the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a US department from Department of Commerce. You can download this and apply it to an organization. And so what you see here is we have the identify, so that's that area, and then you have asset management, which is the group that sits within identify, and then on the right there's an application of the CIA Triad to those risk levels. So and then that's a sort of a scoring. So that's going to be, in this instance, you can kind of make that up, I guess, score out of 10 and, how mature is it? And then on the right, there's the remediation part. So, when are you going to target remediating that to bring it to ideally into green? So what you see here is you see no capability being red, intermediate being yellow, and advanced being green. So it sounds, in this instance, red is probably pretty bad, and then yellow being better and green being best. Again, this is aligned more to the security plus content. In the real world, you may be familiar with something like the capability maturity model. So you might see things like, ad hoc, defined, repeatable, managed, optimized processes using that particular type of model. It really depends, but this is what's out of the content. So in reality, there's not really a right or wrong way to do it. It's just kind of understanding that principle of doing that assessment, doing that gap analysis, and identifying what the gaps are, and then targeting remediation. Access control, and we will delve into this in a lot more detail in a later week. But what we have here is the identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting. So, and you may have heard the terms AAA, and in the past, so AAA, so authentication, authorization, accounting. There is now the term IAM, which also includes the identification component, which was omitted in the earlier AAA framework. And so there is a distinction between identity proofing and creating a user account and authentication. So identification is about proofing the user account creation and making sure that it's a valid creation, which is different from authentication, which is validating the user. So that's where they're slightly different. So the concept here is, historically, when we talk about AAA, we focus on the process that proves that a user account is being accessed for who it was created, whereas that new kind of newer identification. So I'm pretty sure identification wasn't there when I did the Security Plus exam. In this AAA sense, it was more AAA, not I and then AAA. But that identification is making sure that those credentials are actually created in a valid sense. And then you've got authorization and accounting. So authorization is once the authentication has happened, it's about providing, I guess, authorization to what resources that person is allowed, or that subject is allowed to access. So it's not necessarily a person, it could be a service account or something else. And then accounting is really like an auditing. So it's sometimes called auditing, so auditing and accounting. And that's really about recording. So if something happens, you can go back and see what's happened and so forth. And as I said, this is very foundational. We'll dig into a lot more detail as the weeks go on. All right. So we have these security control categories. So managerial, operational, technical, physical. These are, for example, a managerial, which gives oversight of a system, might be a document access policy. Checking that the permissions are applied according to the policy would be an operational control category. And then, the file systems and the permissions within the file systems themselves will be a technical control. And then the last one is probably the obvious one, which is physical. So physical is about being able to access the premises or access the equipment. So that's about physically, real world, not sort of more logical stuff. That is what the physical control category is. So sorry, what was that? And so yeah, it's important to know these. It's important to know that what managerial, operational, technical, and physical control categories are, and know the difference between them. All right, so where the categories describe the implementation type, the functional type describes the control's purpose. So if we look at preventative, detective, and corrective. So preventative is physically or logically restricting unauthorized access, and this is before an attack. So this is dealing with prevention. That whole prevention is better than cure. So permissions policies, encryption, firewalls, barriers, locks, depending on what type of control it is. They are preventative controls. Whereas a detective control is about identifying that something has happened or is happening. And this would occur during an attack. So alarms, monitoring, file verification. So when you think about things like intrusion detection systems, kind of obvious now that I've said it because it has the word detection in it, that is a detective control. And then the final one is corrective control. Sorry, so the final one on this slide is corrective controls. So that's responding to and fixing an incident and preventing its reoccurrence. So policies, data backup, patch management, these are corrective controls. Interestingly, patch management is used an example as a corrective control, but that can also help prevent, right? So, that can help prevent an attack from happening by making sure there's no vulnerabilities. And then you've got the security control function types. So there's directive, deterrent, and compensating. So a directive enforces a rule of behavior. Now you've got deterrence. So deterrence psychologically discourage intrusions. And that can be signs, that can be warning signs, that can be cameras. So cameras, although they may be a detective control, they're also a deterrent because someone that, is potentially thinking about doing something questionable, malicious, maybe, may see a camera and be like, oh, this is probably not a good idea. And then compensating controls are the idea of applying a compensation or a compensating, well, it's compensating control, but applying another control to help mitigate something. So if we look at an example, and we will talk about risk management in a minute, but well, not in a minute, in a few minutes. But if we look at a compensating control, let's say that you've identified that there's a system that is no longer running a supported operating. Sorry, there's an operating system that is no longer supported by the vendor. Happens all the time. And let's say you are not able to get rid of that system because of budgetary constraints or because it's about to get replaced or something. Again, that needs to be justified through effective risk management. But what can happen is a compensating control could be applied to mitigate what potential threats. So, for example, putting it inside a sandbox or isolating it from the network might be an example of a compensating control. Putting more advanced tools to detect and prevent breaches may be a compensating control. It really depends, but that's trying to provide a bit of background on what that means. All right, and then we have information security roles and responsibilities. Now, you should learn this terminology. If you don't already know it or not aware of it, you need to be aware of this. And so overall responsibility will usually sit with a chief information officer or a chief security officer at a higher level. And then you've got the sort of managerial part of this. So that's sort of, the line managers and things like that. And then you've got the sort of technical folks. What's interesting up here is, again, this is taken from the content from CompTIA, but there's also obviously the Chief Information Security Officer role. I think in this instance, they're sort of been separated out a little bit. So you've got Chief Security Officer. The difference here is saying a CSO is responsible for all elements of security, not just information. So for example, physical security. So that's where that sort of CSO comes from. It's not just information. And then we have, the technical elements here, so the information systems security officer, and then, the various sort of non-technical resources as well. But look, be familiar with these terms. They will be in, well, depending on, I don't know if they still do it, but usually they cycle different exams, so that, not two people would potentially get the same questions. Not that you should be talking about it or anything like that anyway, because there's NDAs and stuff like that. But, let's say you are likely to get quizzed on something like that. Right, cool. And then think about your current roles if you're working in this field already. Think about some of the, the information security competencies that are required. So depending on what teams you belong in, whether you're in a GRC team or a SOC or some other sort of defensive role, or whether you're in an offensive capability, think about, or an incident response capability, there's going to be different competencies that are required for information security. So risk assessments and testing is going to be important from a GRC, so governance, risk and compliance capability. And then there's also going to be from more engineering and technical roles, being able to source, install, and configure security devices and software. Administrative staff may do more around, so I say administrative, like system administrators and things like that, might do more around access control and user privileges. Anyone that's doing sort of forensics and so forth may, or even auditing, will be looking at incident response and reporting and potentially auditing, logging in events. I mean, these are all different, I guess, competencies and capabilities that an organization would typically require. So have a think about how these apply to, organizations that you've been in or, or are familiar with. And you'll probably find that there's going to be somebody in there. Sometimes it's many people, sometimes it's less than many people that will have these types of competencies. And yeah, it's, as I said, it depends on the role, but and the size of the organization and the team. But I'm trying to think of an organization where there hasn't been one of these capabilities, and I'm sort of struggling to think of that. So yeah, just be familiar with that as well. And then if we talk about, as I said, those different business units, you've got the Security Operations Center. So that focuses on, being able to identify and respond to threats. So cyber threats that are happening. So that's your SOC. Where there's focus on, development and security, that's sort of the DevSecOps. So, things around making sure that applications are secure and so forth. That's the sort of DevSecOps. And then you've got the incident response piece. So when something does happen and someone needs to respond to that, there's typically a incident response team or a cyber incident response team that will then, activate the incident response plan and, go through and, contain and eradicate and recover from those particular events. I don't know if anybody currently works in one of these sort of business units, but these are the more common ones that are out there. All right, I'm going to pause for a second. And should I go through some of these Q&A and have some water?
Yeah, let's go through some of these Q&A. While you have some water, we can quickly answer the question, would this prepare or help for the formal certificate exam or not? And I believe this this series of webinars will help prepare you for it. You'd still need to do a little bit more study, but you should have some preparation in that area. I'm just trying to give you a moment to rest for a second with the questions that you don't need to be answering.
The short answer is yes, it will. So the content is taken from the Security Plus sort of, it's the Security Plus content. So it's taken from the official, Security Plus resources and things like that. So it will help with the exam. I think the catch here is that typically when if you look at the full breadth of the content, there's enough to be sitting here for about 40 hours. And typically I would recommend, if someone's going to do the exam, that they spend probably about 30 or 40 hours studying the content, depending on how much experience and knowledge they already have. And so it is definitely going to be useful to do that. I guess the challenge here is we're trying to get through all the content, and we can't go too deep, otherwise we're going to not get to the end. Short answer is it will help. But yes, to Chantel, to your point, additional study is definitely recommended. Not just, you need to do multiple sources. And I do see that there's been a couple of questions there around the study guide. If on the earlier slide, there was a link to it, and you can get it directly from CompTIA. You can purchase it from them. I'm not sure in the subject that runs, I assume it's it's one of the prescribed texts, is it? I don't know.
Yes, I believe it is. Yeah. And somebody also asked the question about discounts for the exam. You don't get a discount for the CompTIA exam from this free short course, but if you sit the subject this is based on, ITR 581, then you will get a discount to the exam. we've got some questions about actual topics here. There are so many of them that unfortunately we're definitely not going to be able to get to all of them because we'll be here all night. And I am not perfect at picking out the questions, so please forgive me. One of the earliest questions we got was Stephen asking, what are the key differences between 601 and 701? And that's more about the exams again, but I was wondering if you had any information on that one.
Off the top of my head, no, but I do have information on it because there is a guide on how to transition from 601 to 701. So maybe we should, is there a forum? Maybe we
Yep,
should pop that
there'll be a forum on the
there.
Moodle site.
Yeah, so you can send me a nudge to do that. I guess the other thing is 601 is going end of life next month. So 701 is the new content, but I know your question is probably more focused on, well, what's the difference? Maybe to try and work out what the delta is. There is some guidance on what the transition is. So if someone can just drop me a message, I'll pop that in there.
Yep. And we had two people talking about vulnerability management. So one person had said security control functional type, is this related to vulnerabilities as well? And somebody also asked, does vulnerability management come under this course? So I thought I could ask
So vulnerability management does come under this course. I'm just scrolling back to what week it's in, but the writing is absolutely tiny. Where is it? Oh, I can't read it. Oh, it's 3, I think. Can't quite see it. It's very small. I think it's either in week 3 or 4. We talk about threats and vulnerabilities, so it is covered. Yeah.
Great. Somebody has asked, is it possible to have preventative control at all times?
I probably need a bit more context to that. Because so these are more principles. When you think about preventative controls, it's the type of control that's being applied. So, I mean, the short answer is that you should be, so cybersecurity and information security in general is about evolving. So, you apply a control and sure, it's in there at all times, but it may lose effectiveness, or there may be a vulnerability that pops up somewhere else. So you need to adapt to that. So I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I mean, you should apply adequate preventative controls to mitigate threats, and those would be persistent and stay there all the time until that control potentially has an issue or another vulnerability pops up somewhere. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. Probably need a bit more context on that.
That's all right. I am going to just read out one more question and then we can keep going on. We've got risk management on the screen here, which is obviously where we're going to do. But David is asking how often or when to do risk assessment within an organization.
Yeah, I mean, so that won't come on the exam. I mean, the textbook answer is periodically, which is how long is a piece of string. Look, it really depends on every organization. Every organization is different. As a rule of thumb, you'd want to do it at least once a year, but given that risks change very, very frequently, it would probably be prudent to do it more often than that. It would be something where, depending on what industry you're in, what type of information you have, it would vary. Periodically is the answer, but what those periods are is really dependent. So some do quarterly, some do yearly, some do every 6 months, some do every month. I don't think anyone tends to do a risk assessment every single week, but then there are different risk sources as well. So, and we will cover that off probably shortly.
Okay, great. Let's get back to the presentation and hopefully we don't run too far over time.
Yeah, I don't know. Do we have a time limit?
Yeah, well, something like that.
Because I think we might. But anyway, oh, you know what? I'm exactly halfway through the slide deck. There you go. Anyway, risk management. So I feel like it's a topic dear to my heart. And I didn't mention, I sit in a role that focuses on governance, risk, compliance. I've had many roles, from technical to less technical, which this current role is, to purely advisory type stuff. But I feel, and by the way, this is my slide here, I just think it's important to go, what is risk? So risk is, according to ISO 31000, the effect of uncertainty on objective. Right. It's a bit vague. We often see risk defined as a negative, but there are positive risks too. So just be aware of that. And yeah, let's just be aware of that. So that is what risk is. So it's something that is unknown is what we are, without saying what is risk, it's like risking something. But I use an example of, understanding that a threat actor might try and steal information. Like that is technically that is a risk. And then, looking at that within your environment, what is the likelihood and consequence of that happening? And that's starting to go through the risk assessment piece. And then based on that, what do we need to do? And then there are other concepts which, again, cover off a bit more detail around, what is the appetite and what are the risk tolerances, and are they within appetite, are they not? And then that kind of derives the course of action. Do you then mitigate that risk? Do you accept that risk? And we'll talk about the different sort of treatments. So risk identification and assessment. So risk identification is fundamental to managing risk. And so there are different types of ways to identify risk. So malware attacks, phishing attempts, insider threats, equipment failures, software vulnerabilities, and non-technical risks. These are ones that have been flagged. But just to be fair, because I like to be, a little bit more broad than this, I think that there are other sources too. So things like audit results, you might get information from professional groups and peers. There's threat intelligence as well. So this is not an exhaustive list. This is the one, I guess that's kind of provided in the material, but there are others as well. And so risk assessments evaluate those previously identified risks. So when I say previously identified, as in identified in the first bullet point, to determine their impact to the organization. And that's so I was saying the assessment piece. And so there are different ways to then do that assessment. There are different, ISO 31000, for example, which was quoted before, is a risk management framework that does provide some guidance on that. For many of you, you may have seen risk assessment tables where you've kind of, and I should have stuck one in here, where you've got like what is the likelihood that this risk is going to occur, and the likelihood being, not going to happen. So it's probably not the right word, but like rarely, unlikely, possible, likely, almost certain. That could be like a way to describe the likelihood of a risk. And then what is the consequence or impact of that risk? Is it like minor, or is it negligible, minor, major, catastrophic type of stuff? And then based on those two metrics to say, okay, well, it's, almost certain and it's catastrophic, you could see that that is an extreme risk. And that is that impact to the organization. At which point does that fall outside the appetite? And if it does, you should probably do something about it. So that is the assessment piece. And so when we think about the assessment piece, what we have here is that analysis. So what are the potential risks and the characteristics that define them? And then there's two different ways to do analysis. So you've got quantitative and qualitative. And again, if anyone's gone through any of my previous short courses, you'll see me kind of waffle on about quantitative and qualitative risk. Qualitative risk, which I know is the third one there, but is talking about subjective. So that's based on experience. That's based on someone that has, experience and knowledge saying, well, I think if this were to happen, it would be bad. That's qualitative. It's just a subjective kind of guess a little bit, but based on knowledge and experience. Quantitative is about having tangible values. And so I find personally that, and it's probably not even personal, I think this is just the way it is, that quantitative risk is a better way to articulate risk, but it's harder to obtain. So unless you've had a risk realized before, and you know that it cost you 55 days of outage or, $3 million or whatnot, in which case you probably don't want that to happen again, it's a bit more difficult to get that quantitative figure. I find that finance people will tend to like the quantitative, which makes sense. Whereas, qualitative risk is easier, but it's harder to justify is, what I tend to find. But just be aware of the differences between quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative, tangible values, able to be easily measured. qualitative, subjective. And then you get the risk assessment. So potential risk levels and their significance. So looking at the data collected during the risk analysis, that is the assessment piece. So you do the identify the risk, do the analysis, pop out the assessment. And here, again, this isn't a, what do you call it? A boilerplate kind of table here, but you've got concepts around inherent risk. So inherent risk is the risk of something happening with no controls. So if you look at an example like a phishing attempt, so you've got an email system and without doing anything, what is the inherent risk? So what is the risk that you're going to get phished? It's probably very, very high. And then what happens is you then look at, okay, it's very high. Is that acceptable to the organization? Yes, no, probably no, most likely no. What are the controls? And we will get onto residual risk later, but you apply those controls and end up with residual risk, and we'll cover that off in a minute. And then you can kind of heat map those. So here, I mean, this is a bit of a funny heat map. My heat maps don't tend to have little icons in them. The box would just be yellow or red or green. But we're looking at what the, and sorry, this has a few acronyms on it on this traffic light, but impact. So if we look at legacy Windows clients, we have the impact, which is kind of, a medium level impact with its yellow little exclamation thing. Annual rate of occurrence. So annual rate of occurrence is the amount of times that this event is predicted to happen every year or has happened. It's red, which is obviously high. What is the cost of controls? Okay, pretty expensive. And what is the overall risk of red? So it sounds like, if you get to the end here, where they are red, you should do something about it. I don't think this is the greatest table on earth. I think, again, this is one that's taken from the Security Plus material. But what it's trying to say is that you've got this impact that's yellow. The annual rate of occurrence is high, so it happens a lot. The cost of controls is also quite high, but the overall risk is red, so you should treat it. Whereas you look at untrained staff, the impact is green, so it's probably less important. Annual rate of occurrence, yeah, it happens, but not that high. Cost of controls is low, so the risk is slightly lower. So this is a bit of a tricky one to interpret, but so we won't focus on it too much. Normally what I would do is I would use actual words or numbers. So I would say, okay, well, the impact is high, use the word high. Annual rate of occurrence is, say, 5, so it happens 5 times a year, and the cost of controls is how much, and then come up with an output. And then if we look at the risk management strategy, so once you've identified the risk, analyzed it, and come up with an assessment, you need to determine how to treat the risk or how to manage that risk. And there are 4 main responses to treating that risk. And so that is avoiding it, accepting it, mitigating it, or transferring it. So avoiding the risk is simply not accepting the risk, and not accepting that it doesn't exist. That's very bad. Do not do that. Avoiding it is saying, okay, well, let's say you want to build something, say you want to implement a system, and you do a risk assessment and determine that if a risk that was to be realized was going to cost $50 million, maybe you're just better off not putting that system in at all. That is avoiding the risk. That's what that means. Accepting the risk is where you are happy, or you've done the risk assessment and it falls within the risk appetite and the risk tolerance levels, and there is nothing more to be done, and therefore you accept the risk. And it's normal for an organization to accept some level of risk. If you try to treat every single risk, it's going to be difficult and probably very expensive. And also, you don't want to have a risk the cost of mitigating or treating a risk outweighing the cost of the risk being realized itself. So for example, if you have a system and the losses are projected to be $50,000 and the control to prevent that is $1 million, you probably wouldn't do it. Mitigating the risk is about putting in controls to reduce that risk. And usually what will happen is you reduce that risk to an acceptable level, at which point you accept the risk. And then finally, transferring the risk. So transferring the risk is sharing that responsibility with, or transferring it to some other party, depending on who you speak to. I usually use the insurance one. So if you can insure against a risk, for example, financial losses, that would be an example of triggering the risk. So instead of taking a $1 million hit, if you take an insurance policy with a premium that would cover those losses, that would be transferring the risk. So yeah. And then we have residual risk. So the residual risk, as I didn't want to talk about it before because I knew it was coming, was the amount of risk left after mitigations are implemented. And as I said already, you cannot fully eliminate risk. So say you apply all these controls and now your risk has gone from a extreme to a medium level risk. And let's say that your risk appetite is that we will accept medium level risks. Now, at this point, it's all good, right? So your residual risk is medium. It's within the appetite level. It can now be accepted. Happy days. Obviously, to that question that came up before, these should be revisited on a periodic basis because things can change. Appetites can change. Threat actors can change. All sorts of things. The environment can change. They need to be revisited. But at that point in time, when you've done that assessment, yep, cool, we can accept that one. And as it says here, which I think is kind of what I said before, a lot of this varies as well. Everything varies from organization to organization. Cool. So the processes. So what we have here are just some terms, I guess. So we have identifying, assessing, and mitigating vulnerabilities to threats. And so what is risk? A measure of threats, vulnerabilities, impact, and probability. So what they've done there is they've sort of taken the different sort of criteria and pop that into risk. And in terms of what you've got from some terminology stuff and a risk register. So you will capture your risks in a risk register. Honestly, I think the most widely used risk register on earth is probably Excel. Well, it's probably the most widely tool used for lots of things, but definitely risk registers. And so you will capture things like the risk, so the risk description. So what is it? The severity. So, extreme. And I often capture multiple columns. So I'll say, what's the likelihood consequence, which then spits out that severity. Who owns the risk? Someone needs to own the risk. And then what are the mitigations? So how is that risk going to be treated? And then, yeah, it does say often utilize heat maps. So that, again, is just so you can visually plot, okay, red is bad, green is good, yellow is kind of in between. But yeah, be familiar with that stuff as well. Risk thresholds. So really, this just defines the limits or levels of acceptable risk. Different from appetite, just bear that in mind. So risk appetite is more of a higher level statement that says, for example, the organization has a medium level appetite to data breaches, for example, or a low appetite to data breaches. So that is the appetite. The threshold is actually that limit. So if we think about the appetite being low, but if we think about the threshold saying, but, say we use a quantifiable value and say that it's like $50 million penalties max. Well, that is probably in Australia, that's the OIC maximum penalty. And let's say that the limit is 2 million, then that would exceed it, and therefore it will have exceeded that threshold. So then something needs to be done about it. And then the other pieces to remember here are things like key risk indicators. So what are you monitoring for potential risks? Again, these are definitions that you should be familiar with because you may get questions on them, like what is a key risk indicator? What is a risk threshold? What is risk appetite? And then risk reporting. So, again, here, it's important to not only capture risk and to assess it, but to report it. And that's typically reported to, senior management and so forth. So yeah, just things to be aware of. And I find this one funny. It's just kind of randomly kind of popped in there. Business impact analysis. So again, still on the kind of risk wagon here. Business impact analysis, you may have heard the term BIA. So BIA is an assessment of or an analysis of an organization's systems and critical systems to determine, I guess, what is acceptable. And this will usually be the precursor to business continuity planning. And we do talk about BCP later on. But before doing a BCP, it's important to know what your critical systems are, and what your critical functions are. And it doesn't, and I'm just going to point this out, this doesn't necessarily just involve, information security systems. I've done many BIAs that also include, key people and key resources as well, just as a side note. But the key things to capture here and be familiar again with these terms, things like maximum tolerable downtime, MTD. So that is the maximum time that there could be a system or resource that is unavailable before it starts to impact the ongoing operations and the viability of an organization. So, typically, if you think about I'm trying to think of let's say a retailer website. You've got a retail website, they would have a very small MTD, because what will happen is after, let's say, an MTD of a day, on day 2, they're going to really start losing and hemorrhaging money, right? They're not going to be making, well, not hemorrhage, they're going to make it anymore. So that might be their MTD. Then you've got things like RTO and RPO, so recovery time objective and recovery point objective. So recovery time objective is the target time to recover the system and get it back online, which is going to be different from MTD. So let's say again, retail website as an example, the recovery time objective would be fairly low. So let's say they want to get the website back up within an hour. Maybe that's reasonable, right? RTO, 1 hour. Then you go maximum tolerable downtime, 1 day. In other words, not, if it's over an hour, that's starting to be not great. But if it gets to like a day, that's very, very bad. And then recovery point objective is at what point acceptable loss of information is. And so why that's important is, let's go to, online website, e-commerce website. You would want probably a very small RPO. In other words, and the RPO could be, when I say more broadly, it could be greater than the RTO. It just depends what amount of data loss is acceptable. So if you think of a website that's accepting orders all day, you probably want a very small RPO, because you don't want to lose orders. Because, if you're recovering from a backup that's a day old, you've lost a whole day's worth of orders. And, what are you going to do? You'll never know they existed. Whereas an organization that has systems that don't change much and aren't having real-time transactions might be okay with having a higher RPO. And what happens is all this sort of stuff will feed into business continuity planning, which is then designed to say, okay, to meet these RPOs, these RTOs, these WRTs, these MTDs, this is what we need to do. So for example, an organization that's going to have a very small RPO, RTO, WRT, and MTD are going to have highly available systems. There's going to be a lot of redundancy and clustering and things like that. But what that does is that pushes the cost up. So just bear that in mind. But again, be familiar with the terms. All right. Now, oops, what's happened? Still on risk, as I said, it feels like it's a little bit jumpy. But another thing that's dear to my heart, still in risk, is supply chain risk and vendor selection and third party. Supply chain risk, third party risk, vendor selection, it's all kind of in the same kind of basket there. We've had a lot of breaches that involve third parties. I remember way back in, I don't remember what it was now, 2012, 2013, around then, there was the Target breach. I mean, I was living in the US at the time. And so, a lot of these high profile breaches popped up. And Target, for example, I believe it was widely documented that it was a HVAC contractor that had the breach, but then that affected Target. I've also seen, at least in Australia and the UK, that some of the contractors that supply services to the government have had breaches. And again, we're talking about supply chain type stuff. Monash Health in Australia, they had a breach by a third party that affected them. Red Cross as well. I think even the Latitude breach had third party. That was through third party as well. So it's a very important area to get some focus. And so when we think about vendor selection, there needs to be that third-party vendor assessment that takes place, and doing that due diligence and analyzing organizations for obviously it does say conflict of interest and things like that, but also for their security posture and making sure that they have adequate security controls and so forth needs to be done, and that needs to be done also periodically. It's not a set and forget type thing, so like a reassessment on a periodic basis. Again, if anyone that's going, well, how often is that? Depends on the organization. My typical guidance, again, this bit here, when I say my guidance, wouldn't be in the exam. But for more critical vendors that hold more sensitive information, you would do it more often versus lower priority ones. The point is, it should be done. And so there are various different ways to do this. And so there are vendor assessments, so things like internal audits, independent assessments, penetration testing, supply chain, right to audit clause. These are different ways to get assessments. For anyone that's familiar with things like ISO 27001 or SOC 2 Type 2, you will have seen that these are potentially ways to get some of this independent assessments. So an independent assessor would be like an accounting firm or a big consulting firm going in and doing a SOC 2 Type 2 audit or attestation, or ISO certification body doing an ISO 27001 certification. Often you'll see vendors also will proactively do some of this stuff. So they'll get penetration tests, they'll pop them in their trust centers, you get access to that, have to sign an NDA, SOC 2 Type 2 have to sign an NDA anyway. But doing that sort of thing to get a bit of, to get comfort that they're managing their information security appropriately. There's also this concept of right to audit clause. So talking about the legal agreements and things like that. So a right to audit clause is the vendor saying, I permit you to do an audit of us. That's what a right to audit clause is. And then, as I said, doing that continuous monitoring and so forth. I realize there's a slide up this on attestation, but in terms of initial agreements, memorandum of understanding. So this is just a document that outlines an engagement between two or more parties. It's not legally binding, but it shows that willingness to move forward with the contract. So if you're negotiating with a vendor and they're saying, oh yeah, we haven't got this yet, but it's coming, you might want to put together an MOU. Non-disclosure agreements, that's just around not disclosing confidential information of either party for either or both parties, depending on whether it's a single or a mutual NDA. And then you've got, other things like master services agreements. So these are all agreements that are designed to help ensure that security requirements are complied with. Then you've got things like SLAs. Now, this is probably going to be more applied to things like availability requirements. So making sure that certain levels of service are met, making sure that you responded to in a timely fashion and so forth. Statements of work, again, if it's like a consulting firm that's supplying services, they'll put together a statement of work so it's clear what's the expected output and what you're getting for what you pay for and things like that. Rules of engagement's an interesting one. So for anyone that's doing a penetration test, for example, so getting the security tested, you want to specify rules of engagement. So what IP ranges are the pen testers going to do? At what point do they have to alert? What are the boundaries? It's a very military term, but yeah, ROE. Then you got the attestations and assessments. So this is really where you start looking at those external parties. And as I said, they could be certified public accountants, they could be external auditors, consulting firms, regulatory bodies, there's all sorts. And what they do is, the idea here is that they're impartial and objective. So there's no conflict of interest is the idea. So you get like a big four consulting firm, for example, doing an attestation of a particular organization to say, okay, we've had someone independently view this, there's no bias. And that organization puts hand on heart and says, yep, their security controls are good. Here's the report. So as I said, this is where things like ISO and SOC come into the equation. All penetration testing. So this is using hacking techniques to discover weaknesses in the systems. And so it's referred to as many things. So pen testing, ethical hacking, security testing. For anyone that's read my thesis, you can read all about it. Internal pen testing is performed by a red team. So there is this concept of red team, blue teams. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. And it could include things like active and passive recon. So, active, passive recon, that's about gathering information. Passive stuff might be going and trawling, LinkedIn and social media and those sorts of things. Active might be doing network scanning like Nmap and things like that. And there are different types of pen testing. So you've got known environment pen testing, which I think, they used to be called like white box testing, so known environment. So if you've heard those terms before, and then there's partial, like gray testing, and unknown, which was like black box testing, where you're not given any information. Typically, the rules of engagement will provide bounds, so you might get IP ranges just so that, or you might provide them so the pen tester doesn't accidentally test IPs that they're not allowed to, because that would be illegal. So yeah, but that's a different methods of pen testing. And then talking about those different types. So offensive is red team, right? So this is an organization getting attacked by a team of pen testers. So red team is the attacking team. Defensive is the blue team. So if you think about your SOC and those internal folks that are trying to prevent that pen test from occurring, that's blue team. And it's not covered here, but there's also purple team. So someone might be wondering, well, what about happened to purple team testing? Purple team testing is when there's collaboration between the two. So the red team goes, we're doing stuff, blue team, do you see anything? And they're like, nah, that's purple team. In which case, that's probably a problem if they don't see the red team doing stuff. And that's useful for identifying gaps. Maybe they don't have visibility of that, or they're looking in the wrong place. So that's where that pops up. Physical penetration testing is exactly that. So concepts like tailgating, piggybacking, basically following someone through the secure doors. I'm sure everyone's seen, or yeah, maybe even done that at some point. I'm sure not maliciously, but that's a concept of physical penetration testing. So the pen tester will try and get into an organization without swiping their card and stuff like that. And then you've got this integrated penetration testing, which is combining those different techniques. So this is where you get your purple stuff. This is where you get your broader ethical hacking stuff, where they're starting to use, those different physical plus social engineering plus offensive plus, that is the integrated stuff. All right. Cool. I think we're back to questions because there's a lot of them.
Sorry, I was desperately trying to find my unmute button. As I said earlier, we won't get to all the questions. That's fine. There is a discussion forum where there will be robust discussions, and it's a really good place to put your questions if we don't get to them. And again, I'm not an IT expert, so I may or may not get to the questions that are going to be most interesting. So George, if you see any that you think are incredibly interesting, please feel free to say, this one's a really good one. Sarah asked, in a risk assessment, how is the threat actor assessed? E.g., if an actor has massive access to resources, are they more of a threat, and can this be accounted for?
I want that question. Where's that?
810.
Oh, there. In a risk assessment, how is the threat actor assessed? Yeah, so that's an interesting question because, and I've had this conversation before. It's not like you can ask them. So, you can't go to the threat actor and say, so what do you plan to steal?
How dangerous are you?
Yeah, I know. Do you know what you're doing? So I think this is where we look at things like, and insurers will typically do this. What is the worst case scenario? Because you can't ask the threat actor, you have to assume the worst. So you say that if a threat actor were to get access to blah resource, what is the worst that they could do? And then you usually start from there, and that's how you start to assess the impact and the consequences of that risk being realized. So that's how it's done, because yeah, you simply can't just, it is a bit of guesswork. This kind of goes back to that qualitative thing. But I kind of have the benefit of having been a pen tester in part of my life, that I kind of know what they could do and what they could steal and how they would do it. So having someone with that skill set would definitely be very useful. But yeah, unfortunately, it's a bit of guesswork. But yeah, I usually would take and as insurers will take what is the worst that could happen.
Hope for the best, plan for the worst.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
yeah, sort of.
so we've had a lot of questions about the CompTIA exam. We will put more information on the CompTIA certification and exam on the Learn page, and I think it might be valuable to have just a separate section for that entirely. And this recording will be up by tomorrow, by the end of tomorrow. So that hopefully will answer that question there. I'm just going to continue on with some of these questions. What about resource and knowledge gaps? If someone is unexpectedly away and no one has the knowledge to backfill them?
Unexpectedly, well, like they win the lotto or something.
I don't know. Someone is not there. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, and look,
Because
I think, and the way that I do this, again, this is probably more of just a broad question rather than a specific exam type question. The way that I deal with it is making sure that there's at least more than one person that has those skills. Yes, difficult if, for example, you're a team of one. But with the environments that I work in, there's at least two people that have the capability. That's usually what I do. So that's about basically having high availability for resource and knowledge gaps. Again, that comes down to every organization and budget constraints and things like that. But I would definitely try, generally speaking, and I would do this as well from a systems perspective, is avoiding single points of failure, whether they be people or systems. Otherwise, there's not really much you can do.
great. Is a DNS level web filtering and firewall and DNS solution like NextDNS a good boost up to your security infrastructure?
Oh, that's how long is a piece of string? I mean, look, it depends on the environment. I mean, it sounds like probably a good starting point, but I wouldn't definitively say yes or no. I don't know without knowing anything about the environment.
Okay.
But yeah.
Again, I'm
It's like a
new to this
consulting
area.
question.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I'm just trying to find questions that I think will be interesting.
That arrow one, what does arrow stand for? ARO. I think I did touch on it, is annual rate of occurrence. So when you're doing risk assessment, one of the ways to kind of get an idea of whether you should do something about it is how often it occurs, or how often you believe it will occur. There are some calculations which you should probably also get familiar with around calculating risk. And so if you look at, there's this concept called what is it? It's SLE multiplied by ARO, ALE, not beer. ALE equals SLE multiplied by ARO. And so what that is annual loss expectancy. So how much do you stand to lose in a year if the SLE, so the single loss expectancy, multiplied by the ARO, which is the annual rate of occurrence, were to happen. So to put that into numbers, if something were to, I don't know, catch on fire, in which case, still a security issue because, fire suppression. If something were to catch on fire and was going to cost $10,000 and it happened, ARO, 5 times a year, did I say $10,000? Yeah. Then your ALE is $50,000. Therefore, the quantifiable value that you put in your risk assessment is $50,000. And then you go, well, how much is that going to cost to fix? And if they say, okay, well, it's going to cost you $500,000 in fire suppression, then maybe the decision is just to let it catch on fire. I'm sure if it was a fire, it'd probably be a lot worse than that. So maybe that's not what you should do. But,
yeah, fire suppression's probably not the one that you're going to let go.
No, but if it is only a $10,000 risk at $50,000 a year, then maybe you would, right? But chances are it's going to be a lot more than $10,000. But you kind of get what I'm saying. So all it is it's a multiplier that's used to say how many times does this happen per year, or is this likely to happen per year? And then you just use that to multiply out by what it costs every time it happens to give you a. So it's a quantifiable calculation figure.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I put stop while I'm asleep, trying to tip my dreams.
We've got time for one or two more questions, I think.
Yeah, that was the end of the content for
tonight.
Yeah.
We will have 3 more weeks of content. And at the end, there is a multiple choice exam. It is open book. At the end, you get a certification from IT Masters that is, it's not worth the same as a master's certificate, but it is still useful for some people. But as I said earlier, we have our learn.itmasters.edu.au site where there will be discussion forums where you can ask a lot of these questions for anything that I've missed or any interesting questions that I haven't had a chance to get to, because there are so many questions still left unanswered. One of the things that came up a few times, people mentioned labs, but I'm pretty sure this free short course doesn't have labs.
I will be going through demo of stuff. So there is some demonstrative stuff that will happen in the later weeks. So you can follow along. Maybe what I'll do is if someone wants to, we don't really have time to go through labs and plus there's a lot of folks on the call. But if someone wants to follow along with the lab, we can kind of put up what it's going to be. For example, social engineering toolkit is one of the labs. So having the tools handy, you can kind of go through it. But yeah, unfortunately, it's one of those things where it's more of a show and tell versus you can follow along. So you could do the lab yourself if you wanted.
Great. I'm not sure if this is a relevant question, but let's go ahead anyway. CTI industry has come of age, much is being made of the potential for AI. Do you have any comments on how and where AI solutions fit in the ops model you outlined today? And that was asked at 8:41, if you want to find the question.
Oh, there is a. Look, I think in the ops models, I think it's still, AI is starting to, become adopted by organizations. I tend to look at the AI thing as, using it as an enabler, but also making sure that it's controlled and looking at how AI impacts information security. So there's the part A, using it as a tool to help bolster information security, but there's also the managing the risks related to AI. So I think that's probably more so where I see AI sitting at the moment from an InfoSec perspective. It's like, how do we manage risks related to AI? For example, things like data leakage, things like, misinformation and stuff like that. That's probably where I see AI at the moment, but I think it will probably evolve more. And I think organizations that have security platforms and so forth are starting to build AI into their tools. It is starting to be used in, SOCs and things like that. So yeah, I think it's an interesting space to keep watching. It's a bit of a tricky one.
Great. Maybe we've got time for one more question. Did you see anything while you were going through that you wanted to touch on, or should I just read out the ones that I found?
There's a lot of them.
There's so many. And it's hard to know which ones are going to be relevant for everyone.
Is the Essential 8 a similar framework to the NIST framework or something else? So I'm going to go with something else. So the NIST framework is more of a, quote, framework that provides very high level structure. So, you've got, as I said, that identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, that has those areas within there. NIST is more like probably, it's not quite the same as ISO, but it's probably more aligned to ISO than it is with the Essential 8. So you use that to identify what you need to do, and then you kind of go off and do it and manage it that way. Essential 8 is far more prescriptive. So Essential 8 is basically saying you are going, to comply with the Essential 8, you apply these 8 controls. So the NIST cyber framework, much like ISO, doesn't prescribe any specific controls. It's more of a structure to then build your security program, whereas Essential 8 will say, well, you want to put in app control, patching for applications, patching for operating systems, multi-factor authentication, daily backups, hardening user applications. I'm up to 6. What are the other 2? But you kind of get my point. So very, very different. I think most organizations that will adopt, Essential 8 and NIST, or Essential 8 and ISO, rather than just one. I personally think, and again, Essential 8, I doubt is going to be in the Security Plus exam at all, but Essential 8 is a very, very good starting point for organizations that are starting on that cyber journey, to mitigate, a big chunk of those technical threats. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm really sorry that I could not get to every question, but we would have been here all night, and I'm sure everyone has other things to do. As I said, we have the discussion boards on the learn.itmasters.edu.au site, which is a really good place to put these questions because there'll be a lot of answers from everybody. We will be here for 3 more weeks with George talking about a lot of very exciting, I'm sure, topics to do with this CompTIA Security Plus exam. As I said, we'll have more information on the exam itself on the learn.itmasters.edu.au site, but we will also have weekly quizzes, some more information, the lecture slides, and the recordings uploaded tomorrow. And we will be giving you more information about getting credit into our grad certs and masters, which you can do if you have 3 free short course certificates and other ways as well. And, I'm looking forward to the coming weeks where I'm going to learn more about things that definitely seem to be above and beyond my level, but I'll see what I can learn. George, thank you for your time, and I'll see you guys next week.
Great. Thank you so much.
That all.
Good night.